On a late summer night in the year 410, the people of Rome woke to a sound no living Roman had ever heard inside their own walls, the roar of a foreign army pouring through the gates. For 3 days, Visigoth warriors moved through the streets of the city that had not fallen to a foreign enemy in nearly 800 years. Houses burned, treasures vanished, and the proud heart of the ancient world lay open like a wound. But here is the thing that historians still argue about today: the men who took Rome that night were not strangers to the empire, many of them had once served in its own armies. To understand how that could happen, you have to understand that Rome did not fall in a single night, and it did not fall because of one barbarian king. The Roman Empire was among the largest and most sophisticated states the ancient Mediterranean ever produced, stretching from northern Britain to the deserts of Egypt. At its height, it controlled tens of millions of people, a professional army, a network of roads still walked today, and a bureaucracy that taxed, fed, and governed much of the known world. Yet by the year 476, the western half of that empire had ceased to exist as a political power, its territory carved up among kings who had once been its enemies. The question is not really why Rome fell, it is why it took so long to notice that it was already falling. Many historians trace the deeper cracks to the 3rd century, in a period so chaotic it earned a name of its own, the crisis of the 3rd century. Between the years 235 and 284, the Roman Empire nearly tore itself apart from the inside. In roughly 50 years, a long succession of men claimed the title of emperor, and most of them were murdered, killed in battle, or overthrown by their own soldiers. Think about that pace: an emperor every 2 or 3 years, each one rising on the swords of the army and falling to the same blades. This was the hidden rot beneath the marble. The throne of Rome had become a prize to be seized by whoever commanded the most loyal legions. When generals learn that they can make themselves emperor, they are tempted to stop guarding the borders and start marching on the capital. And while Roman armies were busy fighting each other, the frontiers were left dangerously exposed. Germanic tribes pressed against the Rhine and the Danube, Persian armies struck from the east, and the economy buckled under the strain. To pay the soldiers who kept overthrowing them, emperors debased the currency, shrinking the silver in each coin until Roman money was worth a fraction of what it had once been. Prices spiraled, trust in the coinage collapsed, and in some regions people turned back toward bartering goods. The empire survived this crisis, but the way it survived shaped everything that followed. A soldier emperor named Diocletian came to power in 284 and made a fateful decision: the empire was too vast for one man to rule, so he divided its administration. In time this hardened into an Eastern and a Western empire, each with its own ruler, its own armies, and eventually its own destiny. The Western Empire came to be centered in northern Italy, at Milan and later Ravenna, while the East was anchored on Byzantium, the city later known as Constantinople. On paper it was a clever fix for an impossible job. In practice, it meant that when disaster came, the wealthier, more defensible eastern half could turn its back on the struggling West. And the West, with its long river frontiers and its poorer provinces, was about to face a storm from a direction few expected. That storm did not begin with the Romans at all, it began far to the east, on the open steppe, with a people the Romans barely understood, the Huns. In the late 4th century, these fearsome horse warriors pushed westward, and their advance shoved entire nations ahead of them. Among those fleeing were the Goths, a Germanic people who appeared on the banks of the Danube in the year 376, tens of thousands of them, seeking refuge inside Roman territory. This was a moment on which the Western Empire's fate would turn, though no one alive could have known it. The Eastern Emperor Valens made a calculated gamble. He allowed the Goths to cross the river and settle inside the empire, hoping to turn them into farmers and soldiers. Instead, corrupt Roman officials exploited the refugees mercilessly, cheating them on food to the point that many were driven to sell their own children into slavery to survive. The Goths, starving and betrayed, rose up in fury. In the year 378, the Emperor Valens marched out to crush them near the city of Adrianople. What happened there was a catastrophe that shook the Roman world to its foundations. On a hot August day, the Roman army entered battle exhausted and disorganized, and the Goths fell upon them. By nightfall, a large part of the Eastern Field Army lay dead on the ground, and the emperor himself was killed, his body never recovered. A Roman emperor, destroyed with much of his army by a people who had crossed the border as refugees 2 years earlier. Adrianople proved that Roman armies could be broken, and Rome's enemies took note. Now hold on to one detail, because it matters more than any single battle. After Adrianople, the empire increasingly chose to make peace with the Goths rather than annihilate them. Desperate for manpower, Rome increasingly filled its ranks with the very Germanic warriors it had once fought. These were the foederati, foreign fighters serving under their own leaders, loyal to Rome only as long as Rome paid and respected them. The empire had grown dependent on soldiers who were not Romans, led by chiefs who had their own ambitions. And one of those men was a Goth named Alaric. Alaric had fought for Rome, had led Gothic troops in Roman service, and believed he had earned a secure home and a proper Roman command. But the government in the West, dominated by scheming ministers and the weak young emperor Honorius, kept refusing him. Alaric asked for land for his people, then for payment, then for a fair title. Again and again, Rome stalled, insulted him, and broke its promises. So Alaric did what a betrayed general with an army does, he marched on Rome itself. He besieged the city more than once, negotiated, was betrayed again, and finally, in August of the year 410, the gates were opened, whether by treachery or exhaustion, and his men came in. The sack lasted 3 days, and though Alaric's Christian Goths spared some churches and many lives, the shock to the Roman psyche was total. The Eternal City, the city that had conquered so much of the world, had been plundered by a barbarian king. Far away, the Christian scholar Jerome lamented that the city which had taken the whole world captive had itself been taken. But notice what did not happen in 410, the empire did not officially end. The emperor Honorius was safe behind the marshes of Ravenna, and the Western government limped on for decades more. This is the strange truth of Rome's fall, it was less a single collapse than a slow bleeding out, a series of losses so gradual that many people never realized the empire was dying until it was already dead. Over the following decades, the western provinces slipped away one by one, and the men who held real power were increasingly foreign generals wearing Roman titles. In the 440s and 450s, the Huns struck at the empire directly under their most feared leader, Attila. He ravaged the Balkans, invaded Gaul, and then turned toward Italy, and a mix of resistance, disease, and famine finally turned him back. And here comes the cruelest irony of the whole story. The general who did the most to hold the crumbling West together in these years was Flavius Aetius, sometimes called the last of the Romans. Aetius won victories, played the barbarian tribes against one another, and kept the illusion of a Roman West alive through sheer skill. And in the year 454, his own emperor, Valentinian III, jealous and afraid of him, took part in his killing in the palace. A courtier reportedly told the emperor that he had used his left hand to cut off his right. Months later, in 455, Valentinian himself was assassinated by men once loyal to Aetius, and the western throne descended into chaos. In the year 455, Rome was sacked again, this time by the Vandals, a Germanic people who had already seized the empire's richest breadbasket, the provinces of North Africa. Losing North Africa was a blow that gets far less attention than any battle. That region helped feed the city of Rome and filled the imperial treasury, and once it was gone, the Western Empire could no longer afford an army large enough to defend itself. The money was draining away, the grain was gone, and without them, so was the power. By the 470s, the Western Emperor was little more than a figurehead, propped up or knocked down at the whim of the Germanic commanders who really held power. The last of them was a boy with an almost mythically ironic name. He was called Romulus Augustulus, Romulus, the name of Rome's legendary founder, and Augustulus, meaning Little Augustus, a mocking nickname for a powerless child emperor. He had been placed on the throne by his father, a general named Orestes, who had once served Attila the Hun. But the Germanic soldiers of the Roman army wanted land of their own in Italy, and when they were refused, they turned to their own commander, a man named Odoacer. In the year 476, Odoacer killed Orestes, seized Ravenna, and deposed the boy Emperor Romulus Augustulus. And then Odoacer did something that quietly ended centuries of imperial history in the West. He did not name a new Western emperor. Instead, he sent the imperial regalia east to Constantinople, signaling that the West no longer needed an emperor of its own. With that single gesture, the line of Western Roman emperors came to an end. There was no final battle for the city, no last stand, just a political surrender and a set of imperial insignia sent away to the east. So let us return to that night in 410, and the question we started with: how could the men who sacked Rome have once served in its own armies? The answer is the real story of how Rome fell. The empire was weakened as much from within as by any force from beyond its borders. It taught its generals to fight for the throne instead of the frontier. It strained its own economy paying those generals, leaned ever more on the very peoples at its gates, and then betrayed those soldiers so often that men like Alaric turned their swords around. The barbarians did not simply break down the walls of a healthy empire, they moved into a structure already weakened by civil war, economic strain, and short-sighted leadership. Historians still debate the weight of each cause: the plagues that thinned the population, the tax burdens that crushed the farmers, the religious upheavals, and the shock of the Hunnic invasions. No single one of these explains it, and honest historians admit the picture is disputed and layered rather than simple. But the pattern underneath is hard to miss: Rome could withstand many external enemies, yet struggled to survive its own divisions. And here is the final image, the one that lingers. While the Western Empire dissolved into Germanic kingdoms around the year 476, the eastern half, ruled from Constantinople, did not fall. It survived, calling itself Roman, for nearly another 1,000 years, until 1453. The Romans of the East never accepted that Rome had ended. They kept the name, the law, the title of emperor, and the memory alive for centuries more, so that in a strange way the empire that supposedly fell in 476 never truly agreed to die.